All right, thank you guys so much for continuing our Seeing Through Gebser series. Today we are continuing, let me fix my camera here real quick. We are continuing the transformation and the nature and transformation of poetry. So to be clear, this is not just a poetic excursion because we really like art and it's really soul satisfying or anything like that. It's got nothing to do with that. What we're going to be seeing, especially in this video, because last week we talked about how the muses belong to the mental structure. The muses were memory, recollection, intimate awareness, all that stuff. That belongs to the mental structure. So we are going to see by the end of this video, even though we won't finish this whole subsection today, I don't think. I'd be surprised. Yeah, I don't think we will. And we're going to see how we sort of transcend that. So no longer are we going to be invoking the muses for poetry. Now we're invoking something else. We're invoking spirit. Also, by the way, hopefully you guys saw my last Kill Rationalism video clarifying the vanishing point. I think it was important. It was a little shorter. I think it was only like 15 minutes, which to me might as well be 3 minutes. And I think there might have been some audio problems on that video. Please let me know if you guys think the audio is low on this. I don't want that to happen. Thank you for bringing technical stuff to my attention. I don't want it to be bad production value or anything like that. So thank you. Let me know if you guys hear any audio problems, and I'll try to fix that. Okay, so I'm going to read the last sentence from the paragraph that we left off on last week, and then we'll just keep going. Quote, in a world still dominated by collective feeling and still embedded in the gold ground of the Siamese masters, these poets have ventured to sing of their personal sorrows and joys and to use a word which has become more than self-evident to us, I. Important. So, actually, we'll get there. It is surely no accident that this occurs contemporaneously with Petrarch's discovery of landscape and space and with the anticipation of a perspectival style of painting by Giotto and the brothers Lorenzetti. So, of course, the discovery of perspectivity. Since then, this is important. So since Petrarch, since the mental structure, since the Renaissance, since the Greek pre-perspectival age, since then, it's important, the content of a poem is no longer restricted to the evocation of collectively held preconscious contents. All poetry up until the personal I. The second you started to see an I, that's obviously the letter I, the self, the ego, not EYE. Although there is kind of a weird connection that maybe that was really stupid, but of course, perspectivity, the I, the strong subject, I in the letter, maybe, I don't know, it's probably stupid. It's just what he said. It is the evocation of collectively held pre-conscious content. So once you start to see I in poetry, we are now in the mental sphere. We have the waking diurnal consciousness, we have the strong subject, we have the direction, we have all of that. Before that, we didn't have rationality. It was the pre-held conscious collective beliefs, and we were just sort of putting them to paper. That's important. That's what essentially mythical, magical poetry was. And then mental would change everything. It is henceforth accompanied by the partly conscious statement of moods and experiences that are echoed not only in feeling, but in the rational understanding of the listener or reader, at least to the extent that such moods and experiences are common to all of humanity. This marks the beginning of the so-called lyric poem, and though its effect on the reformation of primordial experiences is minimal, it continues to mold the turbulent gestations of the soul, pain, joy, sorrow, despair, lament, horror, and other psychic states. So probably poetry the way you've thought of it, not this pre-conscious, collectively held contents, but the lyric poem. I'm feeling down, I'm going to write a poem about how down I am, stuff like that. This formative quality is the prime value of lyric poetry, although by comparison to the epic poem, it is a reduced value. Both the lyric and the epic poem afford life its support and space, which is evident from the fact that bereaved persons turn to poems of a sad or melancholy rather than exuberant cast. So this is the beauty of poetry. It's the history of the soul, attributing sense to the senseless, just of the soul. And this is what you lean on poetry for when you're down, okay? When you're feeling bereaved, when you're feeling grief, despair, depressed, you lean on poetry. This is what makes life meaningful. Art is what makes life meaningful. It is a salvation during these rough moments. Emphasis on the temporal aspect. And that's why when you're down because mom died, you're not necessarily going to look for these really upbeat poems, almost like if you've heard the song Lust for Life by Iggy Pop, take that sort of vibe and make it into a poem. You're not going to go for that. You're not going to do this life, soul, the pole, life-affirming stuff. No, we're going to be listening about wanting to blow your head off. And that's the beauty of poetry. Rather than exuberant cast. There they find formed in the poems those things which threaten to overcome them. The poems set them aright and give their sorrow expression and form so that it can be mastered. Again, just beautiful, the way he just does it. The way he can go, and this is going to become more pronounced once we get longer in the book. The way he can just go into each domain and just have a really, really intelligent, respectable understanding of each domain. I just think it's so impressive. The existence of the lyric poem does not, of course, imply that the so-called major forms of poetry have not drawn their sustenance up to recent times from the same well springs from which Homer drew. It is not really necessary to cite examples, since none of these truly great poets, including those of recent generations, has completely abandoned a mythical subject matter. Neither Goethe, nor the English Romantics, nor Hölderlin, who attempted a reformulation of myth. From Racine to Cocteau, which I realize that must be where Cocteau twins got their name from, to Cocteau, the themes bear out the relationship to myth, although we must not overlook that Cocteau's work shows evidence of a maximum of mythical deficiency. So it's not that the myth is being completely renounced now that we've made the switch to the mental structure. Remember, the structures are not necessarily these static, separated things. They become that way when we frame them that way, and we must frame them that way in order to confer any sort of rational understanding. You just need to do that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Just once you're done pausing the TV, hit play and put them back together. All right, Goethe. Even where we are at first glance unaware of any invocation of the Muses, they are still covertly invoked. We would cite merely the example of the touching introductory section of Hölderlin's youthful work, Hyperion, which I've read a little bit, and it is beautiful. I will not lie to you and pretend that I have a super intelligent or deep understanding of it, but when I read it a little bit, it was just like, God, this is genius. Quote, "The beloved soil of my fatherland again affords me joy and sorrow. I spend every morning of late on the heights of the Corinthian isthmus where, like a bee among flowers, my soul often flies back and forth between the seas which cool the feet of my glowing mountains that lie to the right and the left." Beautiful, right? I mean, it's just gorgeous. So in this video, we're going to be touching on some symbolic images, poetic images, and their importance. We're going to be touching on symbolism for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's beneficial for you and your soul. Two, in the name of killing rationalism, we're going to start having a little more respect for the world of symbolism, irrational symbolism. To be clear, we are going to have respect for irrationality. I do not care what the rationalists say. They can go cry about it. So we're going to spend some time talking about it. I think it's important. If I were to just come out here and just say, hey, this poem's really great, Gebser says so, and you should check it out, and I don't explain some of these symbolic interpretations that Gebser makes, it's not going to have that same resonance. It's not going to have that same impact, right? So, yeah. And also, I'm giving, or Gebser, I should say, is giving you kind of a, here's how you really interpret poetry. Here's how you really interpret myth, not this trash, rational nonsense. We're not doing that. So we'll spend some time talking about symbolism. I think it's important. Hölderlin, this is Gebser. Hölderlin has here drawn a primordial image, and the image calls to mind that even in antiquity, the Muses were associated with the bees. So even in antiquity, when you see bees, that's an invocation of the Muses. This reminds me of Charlie Kaufman's adaptation, like the bee. Remember that, what's his name? I always mess his name. Is it Gary Cooper? Is that his name? Oh, I always mess his name up. But he says, like a bee that goes, you pollinate the flower, you adapt, you pollinate. I think, Charlie, you have non-consciously evoked, or invoked, I should say, the Muses. Very interesting. As we know from Polemon, not only water but also honey were the sacrificial offerings made to the Muses in Athens. F. Norick has noted that, quote, Varro calls the bees birds of the Muses, unquote, and in another passage cites a remark attributed to Pausanias, that bees nourished Pindar with honey while he slept. So bees have this clearly nourishing, pollinating, life-giving symbolism and aspect to them. And Gebser says even since antiquity. Rilke, too, and there's a beautiful line coming up that I've quoted 1,000 times ever since I read this the first time. Rilke, too, knew or intuited the symbolic interconnections. In one of his most significant letters, the letter to Hulowitz on the Elegies, he writes, quote, "We are the bees of the invisible." Hold on. Oh, now my pages are stuck together. "We are the bees of the invisible. We collect the honey of the visible and store it up in the golden hive of the invisible." We're going to talk about that line for a second, because when I first read that, that was very powerful to me. This is a very powerful line to me, and maybe it's completely subjective. So if you find that line to be completely shallow, there's no right or wrong answer here. More power to you. Seriously, I don't care. More power to you. You do not have to find what I find profound. You have the power, with your own experiences, your own values, your own soul, to choose what is valuable and what is poignant to you. It doesn't just have to be what I think. That's important. I don't want to seem like I'm imparting. Yeah, I'm obviously trying to, educate, with Gebser, sure. But I'm not trying to think for you. I'm not trying to live your life for you. To take an example, John David Ebener, I mention him all the time. He doesn't find a lot of value in the symbol of the yin and the yang. This is where he and I disagree, and there's really no right answer. No one can ever really prove right or wrong who's correct. I do find a lot of value in that. Once I really got put on to what that symbol, I never really got it. As a rationalist, you have to understand, when I was a rationalist, that made no sense to me. This polar complementarity, it was contradictory. It made no sense. But once I understood it, I realized, it confers such a strong psychological unity, meaning, contentment onto me, and I think it's beautiful. I always think about it, and I think this is expressed in this line here. So he says, "We collect the honey of the visible and store it up in the golden hive of the invisible." So, of course, the honey of the visible, that'd be the rational stuff. So all the stuff that we can understand rationally, that is understood through the senses, all the external visible stuff, we take that and we store it into the golden hive of the invisible. What is that? The soul. So we can very clearly see the polar complementarity on display here. It is not that the honey of the visible is superior to the golden hive of the invisible, or vice versa. There's a polar complementarity, and I think it's very important because it shows a balanced respect for both the external and the internal. It's not just logic and rationality, it's the soul too. And it's just a beautiful phrase. It's just a beautiful diction here. It's just a great image. I've quoted this line 1,000 times, and it really expresses that beautiful polar complementarity. Almost like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where he says, "Winter kept us warm." The way I've always interpreted that as an expression of polar complementarity. The winter, the external visible of the honey, as Rilke just described, in turn causes an internal warmth. So the coldness outside causes an internal warmth. And we can see the polar complementarity here. That's at least my subjective interpretation. Now, Gebser, we might note in passing that Rilke here harks back to an ancient symbolic tradition, as is evident from an ancient reference mentioned by Robert Eisler that bees build the invisible temple of God. With Rilke, we come to our own times. He too has invoked the Muses at the beginning of his major work, the Duino Elegies. There he invokes the antipode of the Muses, which is itself symptomatic of our time. So now he's kind of invoking the Muses, but he's not really. He says he's invoking the antipode of the Muses. Now, why would you want to invoke the antipode of the Muses unless you were trying to transcend the Muses? And this is, to the best of our knowledge, the only instance of such an invocation. All right, so now we're quoting Rilke. "Who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders? And even if one of them suddenly pressed me against his heart, I should fade in the strength of his stronger existence. For beauty's nothing but the beginning of terror." Beautiful. Beautiful. I pity the rationalist who doesn't take this stuff seriously. You can do both. You can take both of these seriously. All right, now Gebser. "The angel is not an expression of the life soul, as were the Muses." So normally you would signify the angel with the life soul of the pole. Or life pole of the soul, excuse me. Dumbass. "It represents the death soul, or the power of death." So the angel that he is invoking here is not a life pole of the soul angel. It's the angel of death. "It is the Egyptian soul bird which developed through its various stages into sirens and terrorizing harpies, and into the avenging, plundering angel of death." If you need a reminder, go rewatch my Soul and Spirit, the symbolism of that section. K. Karenyi has pointed out the extent to which the sirens are expressions of a Hades-like schematic non-being. Does this seem to be too far-fetched? These are merely the interrelationships hidden to consciousness whose discovery was a fitting task for a poet like Rilke. For although he anticipated many things, Rilke remained the ruler over a magical world of interconnection. So Rilke, awakening integral consciousness, and made all these weird connections that normally we would not have made. The invocation of the angel of death, beauty's nothing but the beginning of terror. The invocation of the antipode of the muses affords him all these new interconnections because he's broken free of the rules of rationality in the muses, or even the individual self. He's done with that. Every angel is terrible. Still, though, alas, I invoke you, almost deadly birds of the soul, knowing of you. So when he says, I invoke you, almost deadly birds of the soul, this is very clearly an invocation of the death pole of the soul, not only because he flat out says deadly in relation to soul, but he's also using birds. Remember, back in my soul and spirit videos, bird was the typical manifestation or typical image or symbol of the death pole of the soul. Mount Erie's album, A Crow Looked at Me. Whether he consciously understood this or not, he understood this. Birds look at you. I remember, I think I was reading Freud, like a letter from Freud or something, and he said, he was talking to a patient, and unfortunately his wife had like cancer or something, and she was very close to death, unfortunately. And he went outside because he had to get like water or coffee or something, and he's kind of sitting on the bench, and he's very upset, obviously, and he's looking at the ground, and he looks up, just randomly, and he looks up, and he sees 2 or 3 birds, blackbirds, crows, just standing on a telephone pole, and they're staring right at him, making eye contact. And he knew at that exact moment that his wife passed away. Sure enough, he walks into the hospital. She was dead, unfortunately, obviously. So the connection between birds, it's not, we're not just making things up. Gebser doesn't just make things up, ever. Gebser. This rejection of the living force of poetry, symbolized by water, nymph, and muse, is singular, and its radicality is symptomatic of the extreme bondage of a poet caught up in negativity. Others were able to achieve a detachment by supersession. Precisely the estimation placed on water, which Rilke denies, and thus denies the creative element by his invocation of the angel of death, and the change in this estimation are important indications of the change in our structure of consciousness, and thus are also important for constituting this new consciousness. So invoking the deadly birds of the soul, the angel of death. What else did he say? Denying the estimation of the life pole of the soul and water. He's done with this. We're transcending the traditional stuff. This consciousness is perhaps most clearly discerned where it is not only conceived of as a statement, but also with respect to the source invoked by the creative and speaking poet. To St. Francis of Assisi, water had taken on the aspect of chastity. He calls it, quote, "Sor aqua casta," unquote. The reason for this gradual fading of the ancient, quote-unquote, inspirational aspect can be found in the ascetic way of life, which endeavored to mortify the natural side of man and purify it in accord with the Franciscan and Christian ideal. So, of course, the muses have an inspiration aspect to them. But as he says with Assisi, water had taken on the aspect of chastity. It's no longer about this inspirational aspect. It's no longer about this creative aspect that the light pole, the soul, brings with it. Now it's become, as he just said with St. Francis, chastity. It's being manipulated in accordance with the, what does he call it? The mortification of the natural side of man, which I know John is very big against the Christian theology because it's so anti-sex, but I think for you to hold that view, you would have to be pro-choice. I think when people hold that view, they presuppose that everyone else is pro-choice. I don't see how if you're pro-life, I don't see how you could do anything against the Christian view on sex. I just don't see it, but whatever. This mortification was not only reduced but overextended by Spinoza, who insisted that, quote, nature is a state to be departed from. So this is the mortification that we're talking about. Holderlin, who in his letters always defended Spinoza against Fichte, has given us a turn of speech which is quote-unquote comprehensible only from a spiritual vantage point. This is very important. Such a vantage point is one which admits the natural and soul-extenuated mythical structure that has been tamed by thinking, but is also one in which the intellectual rational standpoint has been superseded, so integral consciousness. So we're superseding rationality, not regressing, so superseding, that's integral, and that also presupposes that we're revitalizing or integrating back the mythical structure. The structure is one where, in contrast to emotive, mirror-like thinking, we find the perspectival structure of the spiritual that is perceptible only to sober insight. Hölderlin is the first to refer to water as being, quote, soberly holy, unquote. With this, a leap has occurred. Water is still, quote-unquote, holy, that is, numinous and permeated by mana, but the mana-ness is, quote-unquote, sober, and thus no longer a seizure. So we can very clearly see the huge benefit of integral consciousness. On one hand, we retain the spiritual powers that permeate everything, which have always been there. They have no matter of ignoring it through ego-willing arrogance is ever going to change that. They have always been. Literally everything in this world is laden with mana and power. Here's the great thing. We can reattain this knowledge of the spiritual aspect while also retaining our rational faculties. As he said, no longer, like with Magic Man, are we compelled or determined by these magical events. Now we can recognize them as magical events and still retain our rational restrainment and still retain our senses. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. You can never accomplish this through pure magic structure or pure mental structure. It's not going to happen. You need integral structure. With a single stroke, the quote-unquote inspiring, mythical, and pathetic aspect has ceased to have the decisive or exclusive role. No longer are spirits invoked or dispelled. It is the Spirit that speaks, not spirits, the Spirit that speaks, the spirit of which Hölderlin sings in the metrical version of Hyperion. To quote Hölderlin, this is really beautiful. This is some really beautiful stuff. The pure spirit, free of suffering, is not concerned with substance, nor is it aware of anything or of itself, nor there is no world for it, since beyond itself is nothing. Beautiful. Later we see, by the way, this rationally, this is incomprehensible. No one cares. This is transparent seeing, or the world being rendered transparent or diaphanous, and having that diaphaneity simply sing through you, almost through some sort of spiritual machination. It's got nothing to do with rationality. Later, we see Hölderlin in his great hymn Patmos passing beyond the abysses of the soul, nature, and confines of ego. This one's a little more inaccessible, I won't lie. To quote Hölderlin, in darkness dwell the eagles. Fearlessly, these alpine suns surmount the abyss over fragile bridges. Surrounding clarity, the summits of time lie around in heaps, and those beloved dwell near, languishing on most inaccessible peaks. Oh, give, then, guiltless water, wings of devoted verity, to cross over and yet to return. Now, we get to Gebser's interpretation. Here a new tone sounds. Despite the ambiguous image of the, quote, summits of time, unquote, lying around, quote unquote, in heaps, we must not fail to notice that Hölderlin here associates time with water. Time, and thus recollection, that's mental time, that is, and thus recollection has reached its maximum. It is piled up in mountains. Thus Hölderlin's cry, give us guiltless water. This is not the water of inspiration or recollection, nor even Lethe's water of forgetfulness. It is nothing that charges or is charged with soul, with soul. For, quote, the pure spirit is not concerned with substance. Rather, the pure spirit, not being aware of anything or of itself, gains awareness of itself through man's poetic statement, wherever such statement is dominated by innocence, devoted verity, and sobriety, that is, spiritual clarity or the freedom from psychic and mental bonds. That's what Hölderlin has achieved. Spiritual clarity, soberly holy. He is able to render the world diaphanous, transparent in its spiritual wholeness while retaining his mental, rational faculties. Beautiful. And interesting, by the way, when he says, oh, give then guiltless water, water being time, I think properly time understood, wings of devoted verity. What does that mean? Now, I don't think Gebser talks about this. This is just my own thing. But let's go through that. So give then guiltless water, wings of devoted verity. So remember, water is time, and devoted verity obviously speaks to this sort of irrational, integral truth, volition, a rational truth, not your spiritual truth, to be clear. Spiritual clarity. That's what he means when he says devoted verity. And he also says that water or time seems to be the vessel that offers you devoted verity. So it seems that time, in accordance with this entire friggin' book, as an intensity, is what will give you spiritual clarity. Why does this happen? Because time intensifies in moments, in qualitatively distinct moments, and brings with it, sometimes, spiritual clarity. The quality of recognition and understanding of truth, a spiritual truth. Like when I had it, when I saw those horses, it was that beauty is embedded in this world. Where that truth came from, I have no idea. But it was there, and I knew it, and I knew it. There it was. The shift in poetry manifests by these examples should be apparent by now. There is a detachment from memory that is the initial step toward the supersession of time, mental time. Memory is always time-bound, and what is even worse, it temporizes the timeless without transforming it into temporal freedom. The turn away from memory, on the other hand, is a turn toward freedom. The poetic emphasis shifts from the recollected past to the present. This is the import of Hugo von Hofmannsthal's remark, quote, poetry as present, the mystical element of poetry, the supersession of time. So key points here. One, we're detaching ourselves from memory. Remember what I said at the beginning, or at last week's video, that muse was memory? Or at least that was part of muse's sort of function. We're done with that. We don't need memory. Why do I need memory? I don't need to look to the past when but the present is what offers me spiritual clarity. Why do I need to look past? I don't need to look at my soul. What is that? The past is already here. I don't need to look past. I'm looking present. That's what soberly holy is. What else? Recollect. Yeah, and then that's the key point, from past to present. So, of course, memory is temporally bound in a mental sense, and now we're switching that. No more memory, no more past. That's the muses. That's the mental structure. Which, honestly, by the way, I hope this doesn't come off as me trying to rip all these poets of the mental structure. These guys are awesome, by the way. All these guys are incredibly talented. They've written some beautiful stuff. Don't think that this is me saying poetry sucks or is dumb or anything. It's the exact opposite. But the new poetry is spiritual clarity. That's what it is. It's the compulsion to write what has been seen spiritually, so in a state of sober holiness. Andre Gild's estimate. Oh, never mind. This change is not only expressed by Holderlin and in his wake by Rilke and George. The turn toward time freedom, which encompasses and requires a new consciousness structure, is not restricted to a particular nationality. It is a European phenomenon that has been underway since the French Revolution. It experienced some setbacks during the later Romantic period and in naturalism, but since that time it has become unmistakably evident. André Gide's estimation of Baudelaire is significant in this context. This is really interesting. Listen to this. Quote, the extraordinary novel achievement wrought by Baudelaire, or whatever, screw it. I hate these French dudes. God. In poetry remained unnoticed when it first occurred. Only the novel manner of the way he treated the themes in his Fleurs d'amour was considered important. His truly revolutionary and unprecedented achievement was that the poet for the first time refused to abandon himself to the lyric ebb and flow and resisted facile inspiration. Interesting how inspiration is being devalued now. It's facile. Oh, inspiration. That's nice. Interesting. He opposed the blandishments of rhetoric, of words and images and superannuated conventions, and treated the muse like something obstinate who was to be subjugated, rather than one allowed to prevail over the poet's spirit and critical acumen. In short, he prevailed upon art to master poetry. In this, he was in opposition to his contemporaries and encouraged by Poe's example. Baudelaire subjected his art to science and consciousness and charged himself as an artist with patience and resolve, unquote. If you want to know a beautiful explanation of how we're transcending the mere muses and mere memory and turning towards spiritual clarity, reread that. It is beautiful. And then Gebser says, in view of the original text printed in note 48, the last sentence might be rendered perhaps more accurately, quote, in opposition to his contemporaries, Baudelaire, encouraged by Poe, applied knowledge and conscience or consciousness, patience and decisiveness to his art. So he says, Mallarmé, if that's how you pronounce it, too strives to achieve this science et patience. In the poem, Prose pour des Scientes, every time I try to speak French, I sound like I'm one of Pablo Escobar's hitmen. I sound like I'm straight out of... it sounds like my ancestors have been conquered by the conquistadors or something. It's just insane. Of programmatic value of his own art, he speaks of a rejection of memory and continues. And then he writes it in French, and of course he doesn't... We'll translate in a second. Before we attempt to translate these verses, it should be noted that Mallarmé, or whatever, Mallarmé, God, has defined the range of the final three words as signifying... God, why does he even do this? Why even write it in French? Gebser. This is what Gebser wrote. This is what he decided to write. Has defined the range of the final three words as signifying, quote, la cristallation d'un country, d'un un vaca... Why? Why are you doing this? Just give it to me in English. What are you doing? Okay. Turning now to a translation, the verses may be rendered as follows in simple prose. Quote, okay, so now we're translating his verse. Quote, for with the help of knowledge, emphasis on knowledge, I bestow in the work of my patience the hymn of spiritual hearts, the crystallization, or transparency, of a new landscape, a new mode of expression, a new worship. End quote. The crystallization, transparency, of a new landscape, a new mode of expression, a new worship. That is 4D, irrational consciousness, integral consciousness, not your yesterday's news, 3D rational stuff. Bullcrap. And then Gebser says, and we reiterate that Mallarmé repudiates memory in the opening strophe, strophe, which precedes this one. He, quote-unquote, bestows from knowledge. It is not fortuitous that... Actually, I don't need them. The stanza of Mallarmé can also be translated in other ways, but one detail will always remain, that the poet is praising the work of consciousness, which is a turning away from the muses and an effort to establish and crystallize three realms, contrit, space, vocabulaire, the word, and culta, that is, in a certain sense, the mental, mythical, and magic elements. I'm going to repeat that for emphasis. That's important. The stanza of Mallarmé can also be translated in other ways, but one detail will always remain, that the poet is praising the work of consciousness, which is a turning away from the muses and an effort to establish and crystallize three realms, contrit, which is space, vocabulaire, which is the word, and culte, that is, in a certain sense, the mental, mythical, and magical elements. So we can see we're no longer just stuck in the mental, right? Or even just the mental and mythical. We're doing all of them, and we're discovering something new, this new landscape. So we have a couple of ways that we're rejecting the muses, we're rejecting memory, and we are favoring instead consciousness and transparency, diaphany. That's very clear signal from 3D to 4D. Okay, let's see what we got here. This is the new obligation, of which Mallarmé speaks in the same poem and to which Guide, or Gid, whatever, alludes in this remark. Quote, it cannot be denied that this new obligation belongs to the order of spirit. So yes, rationalists, we will be taking spirituality deadly seriously. I do not care if you mock us. I will mock you. I understand your mode of thought better than you. Okay, now we're going to get to Valerie. Valerie's got some really great stuff. We'll probably end here. Elsewhere, Valerie has underscored the meaning of this statement when he writes... and then he writes in French, when he writes, quote, if I am to write, I should infinitely prefer writing something feeble that was produced in full consciousness and utter lucidity, rather than being carried out of myself to give birth in a trance to one of the greatest masterpieces in literature. Repeat for emphasis. If I am to write, I should infinitely prefer writing something feeble that was produced in full consciousness and utter lucidity, rather than being carried out of myself to give birth in a trance to one of the greatest masterpieces in literature. Rather than be carried out of myself, that's the muses. Remember in my last week's video? Remember in my Kill Rationalism part 6 or 7, whatever it is? The muses compel you to say what has been seen, right? The muses compel. Now we're in a soberly holy state where no, I'm no longer really compared, but I am in a state of lucidity that is profound, and I must put it to word. It is a little interesting, I can't lie. I'm a little confused when he says, I should prefer writing something feeble that was produced in full consciousness and utter lucidity rather than being carried out. So, of course, the muses carry you out by acting as the invisible facilitators of the process of creativity in man, right? So it's almost like God sing through me, right? But here he's saying he's in full consciousness and utter lucidity. But I guess my question would be, is that utter lucidity compelling? Does that compel him to write? Because if it is, I don't see how that's much different from the muses. But anyways, Gebser says, this should not be construed as an appeal to the validity of the mental structure. Valery writes at the beginning of his Le Difficile, the ultimate judgment on perspectival thinking. Valery has written, quote, oh, this is a good one, the bitterness and humiliation of being bested by things of the mind. Things, after all, that are made for oblivion. Just beautifully said, man. Just beautifully said. T.S. Eliot has reference to Valery's extreme self-consciousness. This encompasses a renunciation of the muses. There is the remarkable observation which Valery has made in his Politics of Spirit that man, by creating time, has created an abuse. He gained perspectives, but at the cost of living henceforth only to the slightest degree in the present. In the same essay, he has written several lines earlier in concrete terms of the word spirit, with which he, quote, does not intend in any way to denote a metaphysical entity, unquote, but simply a power of transformation. That is what a rational spirit is. It is energy that allows you to perceive the world diaphanously, in truth, in volition, none of this nonsense, whose efficacy is vastly different from that of natural forces. On the contrary, its efficacy lies in opposing or allying with one another the forces that are granted to us, from which, among other results, there is an, quote, increment of freedom. There is no longer a form of mental systematic thinking. This is no longer a form of mental systematic thinking. Rather, it is the actualization of systatic elements, and their association with one another is the initial step towards synoretic perception of truth. Only someone who has overcome space and time is able to vanquish or overcome all that has become rigidified and unwound in space and time. That's Gebser, by the way, not Valery. Okay, this is interesting. So he says, this transcending of what we have called the three-dimensional perspectival world into an aperspectival world, this withdrawing from the mentality of the muses into a diaphaneity of the most intense awareness, beautifully said. The withdrawing from the mentality of the muses into a diaphaneity. That is what is happening. Put very simply, just in one sentence. Withdrawing from the muses, heading towards diaphaneity. Very simple. Of the most intense awareness is expressed in a remark of Valery, which T.S. Eliot found quite striking. So I made a mistake, and I accidentally attributed this to T.S. Eliot. It's actually Valery, and T.S. Eliot just probably made it popular because he was like, yeah, this is a really good line. So here's the quote. In my opinion, the most authentic philosophy is not in the objects of reflection so much as in the very act of thought and its manipulation, unquote. Philosophers, listen. The most authentic philosophy is not in the objects of reflection, but in thought itself. Is that not exactly what Jean Gebser is doing? Is he not doing exactly that? He is transcending the mere objects, creating systems of rational causation between objects, and he is thinking about thought itself. And you can even hear this in present day, where you have a bunch of people who are non-consciously aware of this, where they kind of very, very vaguely attack rationality in this very terrible way. But the point is that there is a switch here. There's starting to be a conversation about not what rationality says is right or wrong, but rationality itself. And that is, of course, what Gebser's doing. So let's finish this, and then we'll finish this paragraph, then I got to go. This is a clear renunciation of spatially fixed systemization in favor of what we have defined as systasis. It is at the same time a negation of present-day philosophy in favor of etiology, which does not merely perceive objects in relation to objects, but perceives thinking itself, a detachment from the mental world without irrationalizing it, in contrast to Plato's praise of the muses of philosophy. So we'll stop there, and we'll finish up, I think. Yeah, we'll definitely finish up next week, and then we will get into the new concepts. So we'll do a little bit of the poetry, and then we'll get into the new concepts. Love you guys. You guys are the best, and I will see you soon. Let me know if there's any audio problems. I really hope there isn't, but just let me know. I will see you soon, and keep your eye out for a video eventually. I don't know when, maybe tomorrow, about time as an intensity. I want to get that out to you guys because I think it's very important. I love you guys. You guys are the best, and I will see you next week. Thank you, guys.